The man, upon returning home, discovered something eerie. He saw a completely naked woman lying in a pool of blood. One of her hands was handcuffed to the bedpost, while the other had a deep knife wound. The man instantly felt a wave of nausea, never expecting that the rented villa would turn into a crime scene. Just as he was panicking, Vincent hurriedly entered the room. Luke didn't say a word but raised his hand, pointing inside the room. It was only then that Vincent noticed there was another motionless woman lying on the bed. He could hardly believe his eyes. Vincent nervously approached, but he didn't recognize the woman before him. Luke said he had informed the others. He checked the room and found no signs of forced entry. Not even the alarm was triggered. It meant that the culprit must have had their keys. And at that moment, Chris also rushed over in a hurry. Seeing the woman on the bed, he too was incredibly surprised. But soon the man regained his composure. Chris suspected that his younger brother must be responsible for this. He thought about calling the police but was stopped by Vincent because the four brothers had a hidden secret that couldn't come to light. If the authorities found out, it would ruin everyone's families. While the three of them were arguing, Marty also arrived. However, when he saw the scene, his face filled with terror. The expressions on the four brothers' faces were identical, as if the woman's death had nothing to do with them. Chris gathered his courage and approached the bed. As he slowly turned the woman's body, he finally saw her true face. Yet, they all claimed not to know the woman. The only possibility was that it was the doing of that bastard, Philip. Vincent believed that the four of them had to stick together now, or else none of them would fare well if exposed. Luke didn't want to be involved anymore, but as he tried to leave, Marty stopped him.
"We have to stay together like we said."
Vincent comforted him to stay calm, but Luke believed they were done for. They had been calling Philip countless times, but no one answered. As they were at a loss, Marty discovered a secret on the bed. A few large words were written in blood at the head of the bed, leaving everyone dumbfounded. It read, "Fate has brought us together. It seems none of us can escape." Shortly after, Marty also found a bloody dagger next to the corpse. At that moment, Philip quietly entered the room, catching everyone off guard. Without hesitation, Luke charged towards him, filled with the intention to kill, but Philip seemed unaware of what was happening.
Just answer the fucking question. Did you do this?
Of course not.
Anything to do with this?
Philip claimed that he wasn't even here last night and had gone to the construction site early in the morning. He explained that he was with his father-in-law, which is why he didn't hear the phone calls. Now, everyone denied being the culprit. However, the place had been specially modified, and only the five of them had access. Vincent believed that the killer must be among them. In order to prove their innocence, they all took out their keys, but upon seeing this, Chris hesitated and eventually confessed under the pressure of the others. As it turned out, the five brothers had bought a luxurious apartment to satisfy their own desires. The location was not only beautiful but also in a wealthy area. They claimed it was an investment property, but in reality, it served their illicit secrets. It was meant to be a carefree place where they could bring their assistants for wild parties. And most importantly, it wouldn't leave any records. As long as each person could share a portion of the rent, they could forego credit card and hotel room evidence. In an age where wives were like Conan, this place was their paradise. The brothers were pleased to hear this, and Marty even praised Chris, comparing him to the wisdom of Zhuge Liang. However, Chris hesitated upon hearing this because he had a very happy family. But on this fateful night, his principles wavered due to a woman who approached him and struck up a conversation. Their first meeting unexpectedly left him captivated, and the woman's enchanting smile deeply engraved itself in Chris's heart. A few days later, they all attended Philip's wedding, and the five familiar wives chatted together. Meanwhile, the brothers secretly discussed their male secrets, and Vincent took out the key to the attic from his pocket. The other brothers accepted it without hesitation, but Chris hesitated when he saw it. He felt that the situation was too ironic. His wife was chatting nearby, yet here they were plotting how to have an affair. Chris believed that he didn't need this. He would never do anything to betray his wife. But just as he was preparing to leave, he saw the familiar figure once again. Upon seeing the captivating smile of the woman, Chris's excited heart began to stir once again, but he never expected the woman to be so forward.
Maybe get a cup of coffee, someplace quiet.
Unable to hold onto his principles any longer, Chris was quickly seduced by her and gave in to temptation. He sought out Vincent once again, demanding to reclaim what rightfully belonged to him. With the woman by his side, they headed straight for their secret hideaway. This man who believed he could uphold his boundaries had no idea he would be the first to experience the joy of the attic. However, this only fueled his uncontrollable desires. Chris confessed to the woman that he had fallen in love with her and even fantasized about a wonderful life after divorce. This revelation frightened the woman, who was a professional player. How could she play for real? Saying this, the woman walked away, unwilling to further entangle herself with this easily infatuated man. But Chris didn't give up. In order to prove his love, he pursued her all the way to a store where he finally found her. However, to his surprise, the woman had somehow learned about their secrets and bluntly exposed the brothers' shameful deeds. Chris was left speechless when questioned and, in a desperate attempt, grabbed hold of the woman, handing over the key to the attic and promising to only go there with her in the future. The woman was also surprised that Chris had taken things to a real level. However, another client of hers arrived, and instead of speaking, she got into the guest's car. This was the reason Chris didn't bring the key with him. However, he hadn't given the woman the password, which meant that an outsider would still trigger the alarm if they entered. Clearly, the killer didn't enter using a key. So who opened the door last night? Just as the group was puzzled, the doorbell suddenly rang. The brothers were dumbfounded. This was their secret hideaway. Who would come knocking at this time? Chris nervously answered the phone and was surprised to hear that it was a real estate agent. The agent mentioned a woman named and who had registered the attic for sale. Vincent's nervousness intensified upon hearing the name, while the brothers were still perplexed. Vincent dropped a bombshell. He admitted that he knew the woman on the bed, and it wasn't just him. Luke and Marty also knew her. As the two were left confused, Vincent reminded them. It turned out that not long ago, the three of them were hanging out at a bar when a chubby girl approached them. Instantly, their interest vanished into thin air. Vincent, however, greeted the chubby girl differently, as he believed that every chubby girl must have a beautiful girl by her side. Perhaps that person was on her way, and not long after, the two brothers were proven wrong. A blonde beauty appeared before them, and it was none other than Anne. After the party ended, the group made their way to the rooftop swimming pool. Marty and the chubby girl were entangled together, while Anne developed a liking for Vincent, leaving Luke as the third wheel. Watching the lovebirds in the pool, Luke had no choice but to gracefully step aside. Since then, Vincent brought into the attic every time they met. But last night, after they came here, Anne unexpectedly confessed her feelings and hoped that Vincent would commit to her. However, this crossed a line for Vincent, and he decisively chose to break up with Anne. But as he left, he was certain that the woman was still alive. However, this couldn't explain why someone had registered the attic for sale. At this moment, Philip couldn't take it anymore and believed that Vincent was responsible for what happened to the group. Amidst the argument, Philip grabbed a dagger from the bed. Thankfully, with the other brothers present, they managed to restrain the furious Philip. Frustrated, Philip flung the dagger, and it happened to land in Vincent's hand. The group finally breathed a sigh of relief. After all, they were good brothers, and there was no need for things to escalate to a life-or-death situation. Chris handed everyone a beer, hoping they could sit down and talk things through. But Philip couldn't stay calm. He believed that since Vincent brought Anne into the picture, he must be involved. Unexpectedly, Vincent retorted, biting back at Philip, saying that Philip was the one who enjoyed playing bondage games the most.
You know exactly what I mean.
Philip was left speechless, as Vincent was speaking the truth. A few months ago, on one evening shortly after Philip got married, he had a date with someone. However, he ended up tying the person up. Fortunately, the others arrived in time to prevent a tragedy from happening. With Vincent comforting everyone, the woman ultimately decided not to pursue the matter further. It seemed that Philip was most likely to engage in such twisted activities, as they suspected and distrusted each other. Luke dropped a bombshell. It turned out that there was a secret hideout beneath the attic. Although Luke never brought anyone to the attic, he had an even more bizarre hobby. Before the attic was renovated, he secretly installed surveillance cameras there. While the brothers were furious at this voyeuristic behavior, the most important thing now was to find the killer. When Vincent asked Luke if he had captured the killer on camera, he was taken aback by Luke's response.
Wasn't the first time you broke your own rules. Now you're scared, aren't you? Now you know I've documented pretty much everything you've been up to here. No worries, Vincent. My mouth shut like I always do.
In just a few short sentences, Luke instilled fear in Vincent, but before he could react, he suddenly passed out. It turned out that it was all a setup orchestrated by the four brothers. Vincent had fainted because the drink he had been given was drugged. The following events would shatter their beliefs. Even before Vincent arrived, Luke had discovered the body on the bed. He immediately called the other 3 brothers, but he purposely didn't inform Vincent because he didn't consider them true brothers. Luke led them to his secret hideout. However, when the 3 of them saw its contents, they were dumbfounded. Vincent not only brought Marty's wife,
Hey, maybe I already got even. Maybe Vincent the night you sent him over for that tragic...
but also Philip's sister.
Sister's seriously hot.
Furthermore, even the blonde girl Chris liked was involved.
Gorgeous, huh?
They're the only ones who can hurt you. The people you love.
Pet used to do, sir. Put the hook in so you
I'm what was paid for.
have one share of the loft.
The first time, please, you don't know the half of it, all right? Just go home.
Faced with this depraved beast, the brothers would no longer choose forgiveness. They knew they would be questioned by the police, so they had prepared their alibis in advance. After Chris collected the woman's suicide note, they left Philip to stage the scene, while the rest created evidence of their absence. Because Anne wasn't killed but had consumed a large dose of sleeping pills. In order to make it more convincing, Philip handcuffed the woman to the bed. Then, he grabbed the dagger and cut open her wrist. After completing these actions, he took the woman's finger and wrote a sentence that would guide the police investigation. Now, Vincent had become the sacrificial lamb. Luke took out a cephalosporin pill and forced Vincent to swallow it with alcohol. Finally, the 4 of them undressed Vincent and bound him together with the woman.
No, Vincent, you're not gonna die. But you're gonna survive. Our side, fate will unite us. I lured you here and drugged you. Friends, aren't we?
After finishing everything, they decided to call the police. This way, Vincent would undoubtedly be implicated and ruined. The authorities quickly apprehended Vincent, as his fingerprints were found on the murder weapon. No matter how Vincent tried to explain, he couldn't prove his innocence. The group wiped away all evidence related to the attic, completely distancing themselves from it.
Marty will break, maybe Luke too.
Look, don't tell me.
Friends have alibis.
Alibi?
We've questioned them all. I got no reason to believe they've...
Not for this morning, they don't.
We got Luke Van Owen together at breakfast. We got Marty Landry.
As for Philip, his father-in-law could vouch for him. Vincent had no chance to clear his name, but if you think the story is about to end, you underestimate the allure of this movie. Before Chris was released, he learned from the female police officer that Vincent was now being charged with murder. The forensic examination revealed that the woman did not die from the sedatives she had taken. The true fatal injury was the cut on her wrist. Typically, suicide wounds would not be limited to just one. It was evident that the woman had been murdered, and there was no suicide note left behind. Chris was dumbfounded, realizing that their attempt to make it more realistic had turned them into actual murderers. One by one, the brothers were released, and Chris walked out of the interrogation room in a daze. When he saw Luke, he seemed to understand everything. Nervously, Chris reached into his pocket, but the letter Luke had given him had disappeared. Frantically, he rushed to the attic, searching every corner, until he found it in the trash bin. He then confronted Luke on the attic, demanding to know where the letter had gone. However, Luke pretended to know nothing and attempted to argue his innocence. Chris pulled out his phone, claiming that he had contacted the real estate agent. The agent had given him a phone number, and when Chris dialed that number, Luke's phone rang in response.
I did call them. I thought maybe that...
That note disappeared.
Pulled it off. We've got nothing to worry about now.
For suicide.
The only evidence that could prove it was a suicide had actually been taken by Luke from Chris' pocket when the real estate agent called. He secretly disposed of it in the trash bin because he had forged the letter himself. It turned out that on the night Vincent met Anne, Luke also fell deeply in love with her at that moment. However, he never had the courage to confess his feelings and could only silently play the role of a third wheel. Luke would secretly hide in his secret room every day, observing Vincent and his beloved together, which filled him with both envy and jealousy. Finally, on this particular night, Luke mustered the courage to confess his love to Anne, but he never anticipated that she had no feelings for him whatsoever. As he watched the woman slowly walk away, Luke's character began to darken. Because he had been secretly tracking Vincent, he was well aware of the times they would visit the attic. When Vincent broke up with the woman last night, Luke knocked on her door once again. Under the pretense of offering comfort, Luke had prepared sedatives in advance. After Anne lost consciousness, he carried her to the bed and injected her with adrenaline. After completing everything, he forged the woman's suicide note, determined to begin his own revenge plan. However, He never could have imagined that if he had simply destroyed the letter or not used his own phone to call the agent, so his plan had to be flawless.
I wasn't dead when we left her with Philip.
Brother.
No more cleaning up, Luke.
Chris's words became the final straw that broke the camel's back. Luke would never admit to being a murderer. He grabbed the dagger from the table, deciding to eliminate the only brother who knew the secret. He cornered Chris on the rooftop, threatening him that everything would end if he jumped off. However, unbeknownst to Luke, Chris had already called the police in advance. Upon hearing the sirens, Luke, in a frenzy, charged forward, but in their struggle, Chris managed to knock the dagger out of Luke's hand and delivered a powerful punch. In a panic, Chris picked up the fallen dagger from the ground. With no other options left, Luke shed tears of regret. He hoped that Chris would take care of their family, and then he leaped off the rooftop. In the end, Philip was sentenced to prison for manslaughter. Chris and Marty returned to their family,